All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. Really excited to be kicking off another day of events. Normally, we'd be broadcasting live in the classrooms across North America, but we've shifted gears to be able to broadcast these events live into homes of parents, educators, and students. So it's great to still be able to connect in this way. All right, well, today's event, really excited to have Leon McCarron joining us. Leon is a writer, broadcaster, and adventurer from Northern Ireland. Much of his recent work has been seeking out stories of humanity in parts of the world that are often demonized or misunderstood in Western media. So in the last few years, he's been approaching his storytelling at a much slower pace, taking time to immerse himself in the places that he visits. So to this end, he's walked a 1,000-mile loop of the Holy Land, crossed China from north to south, traveled on foot in countries like Kosovo, Armenia, and the Yemeni island of Socotra. And he's also cycled 14,000 miles across 3 continents, walked the empty quarter desert, and ridden across Patagonia on horseback. Leon's also produced a series of different films, as well as authored 2 books. So Leon, it's so great to have you joining us live today. We're excited to get to know you a little bit better. And then, of course, we'll fire away with a little Q&A action.
Sure. Thank you. What a great introduction. It's always a pleasure to do these. And I thought I would begin by talking a little bit about the concept of adventure in general and why it is that so many of us do this sort of thing. And so I call myself an adventurer, but that term in itself doesn't necessarily mean very much. What I really do is tell stories. I tell stories about different parts of the world, and I write books, I make films, I do radio productions, I give talks, I do as many different things as I can to try and share the stories that I think are important. And the way in which I travel to get these stories is almost always by human power. That is to say, walking, cycling, kayaking, sometimes using horses or camels or other animals, but really going as slow as possible. And I suppose the concept behind that is that the slower you go, the more immersed you are, right? I mean, if you want to get from where you are right now to the next town, however far that might be, if you jump in a car and drive there, you won't see very much. You'll just see a few scenes flashing past the window of the car, and pretty quickly you'll be there. But if you were to set out your front door and start walking, whether it's, 2 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles, you'll see a lot more. You'll experience every single part of that journey very viscerally. You'll smell everything there is to smell and hear everything there is to hear, and so on. So I believe that in every aspect of life, going slowly is something that is very important and is increasingly getting lost in our fast-paced world. So to bring that back to how that works as a job, because it is just about a job, I apply that idea to traveling around the world. And I'm going to share a few little images with you, and then we're going to take a slight detour in this, and I'm going to talk about a slightly different topic as well when we get a little bit further on. But here I'm going to share the first picture with you, which is when I was 21 and I just finished university, and I had dreamed of seeing the world. I'd grown up in small country of Northern Ireland, very, 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 very tiny. And I'd gone to university in England, which is very slightly less tiny, but still tiny. And I just wanted to go out and see what the world had to offer. So I decided to ride my bicycle across North America, starting in New York City, riding through the US, crossing up into Canada a couple of times, and getting to the West Coast. And I'd never done anything like that before. I didn't know anyone else who had. So as you can imagine, I wasn't necessarily very good at doing it. But I tried my best. I bought a bicycle, I loaded it up with everything I could think of, and here is what it looked like. So if you have ever seen anyone going on long bicycle trips, you will know that it probably shouldn't look like this, right? This is far, far too much stuff. My bicycle was I wouldn't say I couldn't move it at all, because I could definitely go downhill, but going uphill was a bit of a challenge. And this is crossing the George Washington Bridge just before I was leaving New York City. And I was so scared of everything. I was terrified of people in their cars. I was terrified of strangers telling me that I shouldn't be in certain places. I was scared that I wasn't fit enough or brave enough. I was terrified of wild animals. I was sure that I was going to try and set up my tent one night and get visited by a bear or something else. So in some of those bags, I'd even brought along a book that was about how to not get eaten by bears. And it was terrible because it was just full of stories of people who had been eaten by bears. And that made my whole trip much, much scarier. And this was meant to be the adventure of a lifetime. I dreamt of it for years and saved up money throughout university for it. But to begin with, it was just so hard. It was so far out of my comfort zone, so different from anything I'd done before, that I just began to wonder, maybe adventure, maybe exploring, maybe all of this stuff is something that only certain types of people can do, right? Maybe only the brave people that you see on TV. Maybe you need to have a certain something that I don't have. And one of the things I'm most grateful for in life is that I didn't give up this journey at that point, because I may still have believed that if that was the case. And that's not true. These are types of things that we can all do. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of adaptation. And it's no surprise that I was a terrible long distance cyclist to begin with, because it was all so new. And as each day went past, I got a little bit better. I got a little stronger. I got a little braver. I didn't get eaten by a bear, so I stopped worrying about that happening. I didn't get knocked off my bike. Strangers weren't mean to me. In fact, they were really, really nice. They would stop, and one guy, after about 3 days, saw me on my bike, insisted on taking me in to buy me a cup of coffee, and then reached into his wallet and took out $20 and told me to go off and have the adventure of a lifetime. And what a remarkable thing for a stranger to do. And before I knew it, I'd made it all the way across North America, and my life of adventure really felt like it had begun. And so after that, I kept going. I ended up cycling 14,000 miles over a couple of years almost. And I came back from that journey. I wrote a book about it. At this point, I still never thought it would be a career. I'd hoped just to do something exciting, something wonderful, something that would change me as a person and teach me more about myself. And it had done all of those things. I felt infinitely more capable than I did before. But I also realized that more interesting maybe than the journey itself and looking inwards at how it was affecting me, that actually traveling slowly was a great way to see other parts of the world and to give a platform to those stories. So I began writing and making films. I wrote my first book about that trip. Then I went, there's a picture of me looking slightly swifter on the bike. And then I went to China and I started an expedition walking the length of the country from the Gobi Desert in the north with my friend Rob Lilwell, all the way down to Hong Kong in the South China Sea. And so on that journey, we walked 3,000 miles, 5,000 kilometers over 6 or 7 months, and got a real cross section through China, which was a wonderful way to see the country. It was a remarkable place. And it was a very, very tough expedition. It pushed us to our limits to walk 20, 30 miles a day. But what a what a privilege to be able to see that place. And so there's been many other journeys since. One of my favorites was crossing the largest sand desert in the world, the Empty Quarter, with my friend Alistair Humphreys, who's also there. We loaded all of our supplies into a steel cart or trailer we dragged behind us. That was about 1,000 miles of walking. I also crossed Patagonia, Argentine Patagonia, down in the southern tip of South America on horseback, following at the time, the last large free-flowing glacial river in the region, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it was due to be dammed. There was planned for 2 enormous dams to be built on the Rio Santa Cruz, and we followed the river to document it in those last months before it disappeared forever. In the last couple of years, my journeys have taken me to other ends of the earth. This is up in the Arctic, where we made a film about an Irish explorer, actually, who'd gone there 180 years ago. And we looked at how things had changed since then. And one of my favorite journeys ever was to the remote island of Socotra, way out in the Indian Ocean. And it's got an incredibly high level of unique species of plants and animals, almost more than anywhere else on Earth. And this is one of the flagship species of the island, the dragon's blood tree, which, as you can see, looks very unusual. And if you were to cut into the bark of the tree, you would find that it bleeds this deep red sap or resin. So it almost looks like the tree is bleeding. So those are some of the sorts of places I've been fortunate to go, and some of the stories I've been able to tell from there. On Socotra, we were trying to show just how fragile this place is, and how important areas like that are, areas that are so often ignored because they are deemed to be dangerous or troubled in other ways, and so they get ignored, not just by travelers but also by scientists and by other teams that might be able to help protect them. So one of the things I wanted to just talk a little bit about today, because it's one of the most recent projects I've been working on, is how in recent years, the last few years, my work has taken me to do a lot of walking, as I mentioned, but also to do a lot of walking on trails. And trails are something that we don't think very much about, right? It's sometimes said that you don't really notice a trail until there isn't one. Trails are what we use every time we go out into nature. Trails for biking through forests or walking through parks, or trails are absolutely everywhere, and they're carefully designed routes that help us access and connect to different people, different places, and pass through more sparsely populated and beautiful areas. And in theory, they should be there to help engage and bring travelers into contact with the place that they're going through. So over the last few years, I've not just been walking on trails, but also involved in the process a little bit of helping to craft them myself. And I saw some great examples of some of the trails that existed, not just the major trails in the world, like the Pacific Crest Trail and the Appalachian Trail in the US, or the Camino de Santiago, but I had a chance to walk on trails in the Middle East, like this picture here of the Sinai Trail, the Sinai Peninsula. This was a collaboration by local Bedouin and international workers who did a fantastic job of mapping out routes across the Sinai Peninsula. And I saw how tourism was able to develop in a sustainable way alongside helping people to access that beautiful area. I also went to the Caucasus Mountains in Armenia, right where Europe meets Asia, and joined my friend Tom Allen, who'd been working on a project called the Trans-Caucasian Trail, which was to design a trail all the way across the countries of Armenia and Georgia through the Caucasus Mountains. And I helped him scout one short section of that, and you can see from these pictures just what a remarkably beautiful area that is. This is a chain of extinct volcanoes. And it was through working with Tom that I began to really think a bit more about what makes a good trail, not just those things that I mentioned before, but also the fact that it is sustainable, that it pays attention to both the local communities who are there, but also to the environment, that it's accessible for people of different age groups, different fitness levels, and so on, and that it uses the existing types of trails and paths that are already there. So last year, I worked on 2 trail projects myself. One was in the north of Iraq, which is not somewhere that would often spring to mind when people think of somewhere to go for a hiking vacation, but it is as you can see from this picture, it's excuse me, it's an incredibly beautiful part of the world, and it's very, very safe as well. I spent a lot of time there over the years, and so we started trying to join up some of the very ancient trade routes and pilgrimage ways and old shepherd's paths through the mountains, and put them all together under the banner of this new trail, and along the way empower local communities and build up a sense of civic pride, and make it something that was very much owned and driven by a local population as well. And one of the other trail projects I worked on, which will be the last journey that I share with you today before we take some more questions, but I will talk about it in a bit of detail, was my work in China. I'd been in China to walk through the country in 2011, 2012, and last year I went back to design what was the first long distance hiking trail in the country that was built to match international standards. There hasn't really been a history of recreational hiking trails in the country. So with my friend and colleague David Landis, we went to Hunan province in the center of the country and began work on this trail. And we focused in on an area called the Shufeng Mountain, partly because that was where some of our local partners had good connections, and also because it was just very, very beautiful, as you can see from this picture of the rice terraces. So at the start of 2019, David and I went there, and the first phase, as you might imagine from the text that I put up there, was simply to scout the area, to cover as many hundreds of miles, kilometers as possible, and digitally document all of the old pre-existing routes. And to do that, to cover as much distance as we could, we started by using mountain bikes, actually, and we just took those out, studied satellite imagery, asked local people, got as many maps as we could, and then just hit the trails and started riding our bikes. And it was, if you like biking, it was one of the most fun things you can ever imagine. And we'd ride these trails every single day. We'd hit some obstacles once in a while. Sometimes there was a bit of traffic on the path. But most of the time it was just a joy to be traveling around. We'd also sometimes trail run, not necessarily to make it more difficult or to try and be more athletic than we needed to be, but just because it helped us cover more distance. And we'd map out where all the blockages were, where there might be rivers or the trail needed to be rerouted, and eventually created this sort of matrix of all the usable trails in the area. And the ones we were most excited about, of course, were the trails that were really, really old, that had been there for hundreds of years. In this part of China in particular, it was the old stone steps that had been laid there maybe 300, 400 years ago by villagers to get from one place to the next. So once we had all of that, we went away, wrote up all of our notes, looked at all of our data, and then came back and figured out what was the best sort of single track, single pathway through the area. And we walked through that, spent a bit more time with local communities, with our translators and our local partners, talking to people, getting as much information as we could about local culture, talking to each of the villages about making sure they were in support of the idea, and that they'd want a small number, a well-managed number of tourists to come through if this trail was to be a success. Getting all of the stories of how these villages came to be, how old they were, often from some of the eldest and most experienced and probably wisest members of the community. They were the guardians of those stories that might well disappear pretty soon. And of course, trying as much as possible of all the local food and building that into our idea as well. Because if you're going to bike and run and hike lots and lots of miles every single day, you need to eat a lot of food to keep yourself going. That's really important. So that was the second part. Then we began to create all of the resources, all of the maps, and writing out all the information about it. And then finally went back for another trip and tried to experience the trail as we imagined future hikers might, just doing what we call a through hike, which is starting at one end and finishing at the other end and staying in all of the accommodations along the way and using the trail that we'd worked on. Checking in with, again, the local pioneers who we'd been working with, waymarking the trail, putting dabs of paint on to help with navigation. And with the waymarking, you never want it to be too obvious so that it starts to impact on the natural world and experience around you, but it's just a little reminder to keep hikers confident that they're on the right track, and it's used in conjunction with the other methods. And there's my friend and colleague David there coming towards the end of our through hike. So I think the trails are something that are really, really exciting to me, really important, because they're about so much more than walking, right? They offer huge benefits, both for those who walk on them, because you get to experience somewhere new, you get to have the sense of adventure, but you also have a bit of security that you're going to be directed in the right way. You're not going to end up anywhere too dangerous. Keeps you fit and healthy. If you're on a trail that has good resources, you can learn a little bit more about the history and culture. You can meet people. And for the people who live along the trail, it creates a new type of economy for offering accommodation, for guides, for offering foods, all those sorts of things. And it's not just the trail itself, it's the whole area around it. And so it's, if I was to summarize it, I would say that really good trail projects are sustainable, and they offer an improvement in people's quality of life. And in many ways, both the experience of being a trail user and of being a trail designer are some of the most rewarding adventures I've been on, because it creates something for many, many others to use, whether that is just a few hundred in the first year of a trail's life, hopefully to many hundreds of thousands as it progresses, like the great trails of the world have done. So it's an unusual time in the world right now. I'm not going to say any more about that because it's all we ever hear about. It's fun just to talk about something completely different. But the great trails of the world and new trails of the world are all lying empty right now. And trails, I believe, really only exist when people walk on them. You know, if there's not footsteps going across those tracks, the natural world will take over. So I would encourage you, when things change and go back to normal, consider getting out on your local trails, whether it's the ones that are close to where you live or a little bit further away, or trails you've dreamt of on the other side of the world. But get out there and use them, because it creates an awful lot of good for you and for everyone else. All right, so look, that's been a lot of fun. Thank you for listening to me talk about it. I'd love to take any questions if anybody has some.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks, Leon. Thanks for sharing a little bit of adventure with us. Thanks for sharing some of your more recent projects as well. And you're right, there's so many amazing places close to home, trails that people can use. And you know, some of them are still accessible now to get outside and walk those trails, make sure you're getting some fresh air and staying active.
Right, exactly.
All right, awesome. Well, let's get things started. So questions, use the chat sidebar on the right on YouTube. Of course, let us know where you're tuning in from as well. And so we're going to start. Brian sent in a question, and Brian is curious, Leon, about how many countries that you've traveled to.
Gosh, it's a good question. It's one I get asked reasonably often, and it's one that I don't actually know the answer to. It's probably around 100. I think it's over 100. But when I was younger, I really used to get excited about the number of countries I'd been to, and I would keep a tally. Now I'm not so interested. I consider myself very privileged to have been to so many countries, but if I really think about the countries that I've seen in depth and really immersed myself in, the number is a lot lower. So these days I'm focusing on getting to know fewer countries in a much deeper way.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think far too often adventure exploration is seen as numbers and what you can show that you've done. And I think it's really important that the travel that you do is for you in a lot of ways, and you do some good while you're doing it, and you know, it helps you grow and builds you as a person.
Yeah, for sure. Well said.
All right. Lucius is wondering about a favorite place that's a favorite journey, a favorite place that you've been, maybe somewhere you think about often.
Well, there's a few. On that long bike trip that I did 10 or more years ago, I rode my bike through New Zealand, which is an incredible place. It's very, very beautiful. People are very friendly. It's all quite on a small scale, so it feels quite accessible, but it's just a really exciting place. And then in 2014, I followed the longest river in Iran from source to sea, and that was a really wild and exciting adventure journey, but it's really stayed with me, and I think about it probably more often than most of my other journeys, because Iran is a country that we hear so much about in the news, but it's almost always negative. And I had a very different experience. I had a very personal experience of meeting normal, everyday Iranian folks as I was going down this river with my friend Tom. And to summarize how friendly and enjoyable that trip was, I would say that it took us 6 weeks, and we brought a tent expecting to sleep in that tent every single night. And we only used the tent once, because every other night we were taken into the homes of complete strangers who looked after us and fed us and sent us on our way. So I think about Iran and how beautiful and friendly it was a lot.
Yeah, I think that's one of Those are my favorite stories, I think, that you share with us. So you've done several of these events for us in the past where we've had classrooms joining in. And the stories you share from your travels through the Middle East are nothing like what we see on the news and how these countries are portrayed. And I think it's really amazing when you share those stories and how, everywhere that you arrive, you immediately oftentimes find food and places to stay and you're welcomed into people's homes. I think those are such important stories to be sharing.
Yeah, and it's I consider it sort of one of the greatest joys of my job to be able to share those stories. So thanks for that.
All right. So Maya sent in a question. Maya's curious about wildlife experience that you've had on some of the trails you've been walking.
Wow, yeah. Wildlife experiences, it's always a funny one. And, in general, on trails, animals are pretty clever, whether they're small or big. They know to stay reasonably far away from trails because that's where the humans are, and humans are generally represent danger. But I've seen a couple of bears when I've been hiking in the US, which has been pretty exciting. I see a lot of, when I'm in the Middle East, I see a lot of really exciting birds of prey, which is kind of cool. And most recently, when I was hiking in northern Iraq, I saw some wolf tracks, which was pretty awesome. I haven't yet had the joy of seeing the wolf itself, but I've seen the tracks, and I think we probably know where there are some wolves. So hopefully next time we'll maybe try and set up a little camera and capture something there.
Yeah. I'm just thinking back to one of the little documentaries you made after rafting down the river. I think it was Karun.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I can remember you guys camping out one night and hearing the wolves
Yeah.
side of the tent. So if anybody tuning in today wanted to maybe look for or check out some of your documentaries, can you tell us about one or two and where they can find them?
Yeah, sure. So I've made, I think, four documentaries so far, and a couple of things for TV as well. Most stuff is online. The majority of it is free. A couple are behind paywalls because they were commissioned by other people. But yeah, most of it's on there. So there's a film about crossing the largest sand desert in the world, the Empty Quarter, which I showed a picture of. That's actually right on YouTube, full-length, hour-long documentary. And there's also the one about going down the longest river in Iran. There's one about riding horses across Patagonia. And there's a cool, fun film I made a little while ago about a community called the Samaritans in the Middle East, who claim to be one of the smallest and oldest communities in the world. And for anyone who knows their Bible stories, they are the Samaritans of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and they still exist. But there's just over 800 of them in existence at the moment, and they live on top of a mountain in the middle of the Holy Land and in the West Bank. And I went to make a film that's on YouTube about their community. So that's a fun one.
All right, very cool. Kira is wondering, and probably a lot of people are thinking of maybe taking some trips or doing some adventure. How do these opportunities come about? How do some of these opportunities come your way to do this kind of travel?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have any sort of really prescriptive advice about it, except to say that when I started doing this, I had no contacts or opportunities in the travel and adventure world. But after I did that first journey, I just started meeting people who were also interested in the same things and connected in the same ways. And it took about 5 or 6 years before it really turned into something where it was sort of more sustainable. And but during that time, I just made a point of reaching out as often as possible to anyone who I thought was doing anything interesting. Anyone I saw on social media who was doing an interesting trip, I'd reach out and say hi, just exchange a few emails, see what they were up to, not with anything in mind, just to say well done on creating something really interesting or making an interesting journey. And through that, I've either had people I know well or don't really know at all reach out to me and ask if I'd like to join them on journeys. as I built up experience with writing and making films, I've had more connections to publish things and make stuff for TV. But just in the purest sense of finding out how to go and do these things and where they are, it's just been a case of tracking down the people who are already doing it and asking them, just saying, hey, like, what's up? How can I get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some people talk themselves out of things, about taking trips or trying something new, like writing or something. So I think, if you're passionate about something, you've just got to go for it. And, the first couple of years might not be easy, but as you progress and work towards something, things, tend to go a little better.
For sure.
All right. So there's definitely a lot of curiosity about the wildlife you encounter. And you may or may not be able to answer this, but maybe you heard something as well while you were in these countries. But Brian in Ontario is curious about the wolves in Iraq or Iran. Are they similar to the North American species?
I believe not. I mean, I believe that they're smaller, and I mean, in fact, there's a difference between even some of the wolves that you'd find in Iran and in Iraq. There's I think there are more wolves in Iran than there are in Iraq at this point, because more have been hunted. But I think they're slightly smaller in the Middle East than the wolves you might find in North America, and generally less widespread. They're pretty endangered in that part of the world.
Okay. Okay. Longest trail that you've traveled on?
Good question. The longest trail, I mean, I've done lots of very long walks, but often without a trail. So probably the longest, I've only ever hiked small sections of the PCT or the Appalachian, but I've hiked the full length of the Camino de Santiago trail, which runs across northern Spain. That's about 500 miles. I've hiked a few different variations of it. So that's probably one of the longest, as a continuous trail.
Okay. So Leon, when you get ready for, the first picture you showed us, you had your bike loaded up on one of your first adventures, you had tons of gear. You obviously planned a lot. Do you find that you still plan a lot before your expeditions, or do you find that you're more comfortable now and maybe there's less planning that goes into it?
I would say there's more planning that goes into it, actually, but it's a different type. In those early days, I planned a lot in a practical sense and logistical sense, and that was because I didn't know what I was doing. And I think that's fine. There may be some people watching who feel like they don't have a lot of experience but would like to learn. And a lot of the stuff I learned about this, I learned by doing. I learned by experiencing it, and actually by getting it wrong a lot of the time as well. But if you try and load up a bicycle to ride a long distance and it's too heavy, you pretty quickly learn the stuff that you need and the stuff that you don't, and you don't make that mistake twice. But these days I plan a lot, but it's much more, I'm comfortable with what I need to put in a backpack to go hiking for a week. I know what's to rely on and so on, but I will spend a lot of time trying to familiarize myself with the region I'm going to and learn as much as I can. So it's much more of a academic preparation than physical these days.
All right. So we've got a question here about backpacking. So we've got someone who really wants in the next few years to start doing some backpacking, meet new people. Do you have, I'm sure there's lots of tips and tricks and advice, but is there a piece or two of advice about that kind of travel and maybe a downside to that kind of travel?
Sure. I mean, I think, backpacking is great because it can mean a few different things, but it as far as I would understand it, it's a way to both get out on a trail and experience nature, but it also, by just having all your belongings in a backpack, it means you can sort of do a bit of everything. You can also hop on a bus, or you can hop on a plane and go somewhere else. You can kind of just keep traveling for a while and get out as much as possible. But I guess I would say the most valuable experiences I've had in life have been ones that are quite focused. I used to think that the more of the world I saw, the more joy I would feel and the cleverer I would be, and all of that. But actually, just going to one or two places and getting to know them really well and really feeling like I understand them or can contribute to that area has been much more valuable. So I would maybe encourage people to find a place that they really want to go to and spend more time getting to know that area. And then on a practical side, I would say the two most important things by far are the actual backpack that you use and the boots that you wear on your feet. Everything else you can kind of get away with having maybe slightly less high quality versions of it. I mean, good clothing stuff is nice, but it's not as essential. But you need something that really fits comfortably on your back, and you need boots that aren't going to give you blisters and stuff if you're walking long days, even if it's just around cities. So that was some of the best advice I was ever given early on, was make sure your boots fit and your pack fits, and everything else is easy after that.
Okay, good advice. Okay, injuries while out exploring. Have you had any on an expedition or a journey?
I have had small injuries, but never anything too serious. So I'm feeling pretty lucky at this point. I've had, just kind of twisted ankles and stuff. I've been part of expeditions and trips where people have had more serious injuries, and we had one where someone fell and broke a leg, and we had to get them airlifted out, medevaced out, and that was pretty intense, and we were fortunate that we were in an area where we could get a helicopter in to get them out. And it's always a fine line between, the more remote places you go to, there is a fine line, and you do have to take a lot of responsibility for yourself. And then there's a sort of element of luck involved as well. So this far, I'm touching this wooden desk right now. I'm feeling fortunate to not have had anything too serious.
All right. Okay. I like this question. So Kira's watched your short video when you walked through the empty corridor. And she's wondering how you felt throughout that trip mentally. How did you prepare yourself for something like that?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. It was 46 days in the desert, and there was just two of us, and we did meet people occasionally, but we had a lot of time on our own. And there's only so much preparation you can do with stuff like that. But a lot of how we dealt with it was by making sure the emotions that you experience in a time like that and on a trip like that are much more extreme than normal. So you have higher highs and lower lows. And because there's very little externally, especially in a desert, to influence you, you're very much inside your own head. So one of the most important things that I would do is each morning, before I got out of my sleeping bag, I would remind myself 5 or 10 things that I felt really lucky about in life. One of them being to be able to be in the middle of a beautiful desert and just to get to go hiking through it every day, which might sound a little bit cliched or whatever, but it was really, really important, because I noticed early on, if I woke up and I didn't do that and I just felt a bit grumpy or tired, or, my back hurt a little bit, it was so easy to spiral and just find it very, very demoralizing and feel like I was still 45 days away from my destination. So it was really important just to try and bring my spirits up, and then to make the most of where I was, to not focus on what I was missing out on, but to really put my efforts into focusing on what was around me, to enjoy the experience of silence and of a vast expansive desert around me, and of feeling fit and strong, and just for hours on end to go into a kind of void in my head where I would appreciate those elements. And so a lot of it had quite a lot of qualities of meditation about it. And there were low times, but with a bit of help, we were able to enjoy it. And I consider it one of my most formative experiences in life because of that.
All right. And Leon, let's hit you with a final question. Is there an explorer or an adventurer who inspired or currently inspires you?
Well, one person I really admire right now is Paul Salopek, who is currently walking most of the way around the world. He's walking in the footsteps of our ancestors. He started in East Africa, I don't know, 7 years ago now, and he's trying to follow the migration of the first humans. And so he's somewhere in the middle of Asia right now, and he's been going a very long time. But along the way, he's sharing stories of people he meets and the places that he goes through at walking speed, which I think is really important. So I love following that journey. It fits in with the ethos of things I value. And back in the day, I always loved the first adventure story I ever read was by Ernest Shackleton, who was the great explorer who went off to Antarctica, and his book South I would recommend to anyone who wants to read about endurance and resilience and how to cope when things go wrong and still come out of it with a positive spin.
All right. I love that you brought up Paul. I've been lucky enough to host Paul about a dozen or so times along his Out of Eden journey. So places like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, India, Myanmar. So he's in Myanmar right now. And we have an event coming up with him April 17th at 9 a.m. Eastern. So anybody tuning in today who wants to tune into that at 9 a.m. Eastern on the 17th, I highly suggest tuning in. Paul's a great speaker and always has amazing stories to share from his time walking the global trail.
Well, I'll be tuning into that one at least. I'll be sending most of the questions for that one.
Perfect. Well, I will send you a link. I'll remind you of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, a huge shout out to those tuning in via YouTube. Thanks for sending us in the great questions. It's always great to be connected, especially in times like these. So to be able to share stories and ask questions and learn new things, I think is pretty important. And Leon, a huge thank you to you. It's always a pleasure hosting you. We love having you share your stories and your insights from your travels around the world. Yeah, and thanks so much for doing that again with us today.
Hey, it's a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. It's a highlight. So I look forward to the next time.
All right, awesome. Well, again, thanks everyone for tuning in. We have a full day of events today, so we hope to see more people joining in today. So thanks, everyone.